So we really want to pick up where Maxine left off and have a conversation about how can diversity help us, how can analytics help us reach those milestones in diversity? And so I want to start at the recruitment phase. And I think, exactly as Maxine said, there's this problem of the N being small. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So I do some research on this. And the promise of analytics is that there's this idea that you could take human bias out of the process, right? Because we know that human bias gets in the way. We know that people have these implicit biases. So, we could replace that with more objective metrics, right? So I always think of the scene in Moneyball where the old school scouts are like, no, I don't like his walk. He has an ugly girlfriend. We can't have that guy, right? And, and then Billy Bean says, no, but he gets on base. That's the metric we're going to use, right? So there you see the promise of it, is saying instead of you just going with some gut feeling, because we know those gut feelings can be biased. So another example in the corporate world is there's that quote from Paul Graham, who's this famous startup mentor and incubator, where he says, I can get fooled by anybody who looks like Mark Zuckerberg, because we have this idea that the next startup founder has to be that young white guy in a hoodie who's been coding in his basement since he was 10 years old, right? And then it turns out, actually, there was a study done out of Berkeley Haas where they found that the average age of a successful startup founder was 38. It's not the, 21-year-old college dropout who, has been coding in his basement. And so, that's the promise of analytics, is that we can take that human gut feeling that can actually lead us astray out of the process, take out the fact that where we feel, oh, the young white guy is going to be successful, and we can replace it with something objective. Okay, but then here's the but, and this is what I want you guys to speak to. At the same time, there's the risk that if all we have to go on to build those objective metrics is past data, we might actually hard code in some of the biases from the past. And so we think we're using a very objective, fair system, but you say, for example, one of the objective metrics, let's say you're at a software company and you find that engineers who were involved in a software club going back to high school have a very high rate of success. So you hard code in, we're going to give extra points on the resume and the algorithm, because the machine learning just recognizes this factor as something driving success. Well, what if there were no women in startup clubs in high school, and that doesn't mean in software clubs in high school, and that doesn't mean that they're not going to be successful. But as Maxine said, we just don't have the data. We don't have enough data to tell us, well, what makes the female engineer successful. So that's what I want you to speak on. I'm going to start with Derek to give us kind of the academic perspective, and then we'll get to the more practical perspective.
Okay. So I think that there are a couple of issues. I agree with you that we have the garbage in, garbage out problem, which is synonymous with what we have with most statistical analytical techniques, such as meta-analysis. So we've got to be really careful, because we're always going to be bound by the quality of our measures. If we've got measurement error and we're trying to use that in predictive modeling, then we're going to be compounding that measurement error and potentially creating more discriminatory mechanisms than what we've currently got in place. I think one of the other things that we've got to really be careful about when we start to think about the promise for analytics as a remediation mechanism for discrimination is that you get 10 diversity experts in a room and ask them what discrimination is, and you get 11 definitions. It's very, very difficult to agree about. I remember in undergrad, I had a professor who talked about the Supreme Court when they were discussing what pornography is and what pornography isn't, and you had the justice who very famously said, I know it when I see it. Well, with discrimination, we don't know it when we see it. So to think that we can create algorithms that are going to be able to identify what we can't even agree upon is a little bit misleading, which is why I always get concerned when I see the next new article that comes out that says, oh, X company has created an algorithm that eliminates discrimination. I go, oh boy.
So, and is what you're saying, though, because you're saying the algorithms can't recognize discrimination, but do they need to be successful at doing a better job than humans at picking in a, quote, objective way?
Well, I think that they need to know what they're looking for. So when I design an algorithm, if I'm a programmer, I need to have a sense of what it is that I'm telling it to look for, right? Because if I don't know what it is that, if discrimination is nebulous to me, then it's very difficult for me to tell it, this is what it is that you're looking for. And I think that that's part of the reason why I also think when we start talking about diversity, we've got to think about the folks who are designing the algorithms and who are, planning the, the interventions and who are, because if we don't have diversity in that room, as we just heard this morning, there are some things that we know without necessarily being able to prove. And if we're not implementing that knowledge on the front end of the science, then the science isn't necessarily going to lead us closer to a solution.
So Joelle or Laura, do you have anything to add to this about what's the promise and what's the danger? And I'm talking about the recruitment side, and we'll move on to, other things. But
I would just add to the promise, I think there are a lot of different ways we could think about determining how to assess people. And I think you highlighted some of the ways that data could lead us astray. We've identified a factor, but that factor itself is filtering people out. But I think something far too few companies do is actually measure the impact of whatever it was that their decision was, whatever metric they chose. Because no matter what you choose, you shouldn't expect to see disparities emerging in your hiring process. You shouldn't expect to see differences in pass-through rates at each stage of the process. And that should be a good indicator that whatever you've chosen might not be quite right, that whatever you've chosen either intentionally or perhaps implicitly is producing a gap. So I think reasonable people could debate how to articulate those factors up front. But I think what every organization can do is start to understand the impact of the factors they've chosen and then make changes as they go.
And Laura, have you seen examples of this in your career where there's a metric that's chosen and that metric ends up building in a sort of inequality into the system?
Well, my experience around this is that it can be seen as a metric, but most organizations that I've worked with or interacted with are still in what I call the Noah's Ark phase of diversity, which is, God, if we could only just get 2 of each in the ark, we'll have our diversity, right? But the qualitative part of that is if, and you can do the quantitative element to that, but the qualitative part is if the giraffe looks at the zebra and says, God, you're funny looking. How do you do anything with that stupid short neck of yours? You don't actually get this cognitive diversity that you're talking about. I mean, we can remember Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, where he talks about the fact that in the United States, 16% of men in the United States are 6 feet or taller. And 57% of Fortune 500 male CEOs are 6 feet or taller. You get a metric there. And yet I've done research on this, and I've never seen any research that correlates leadership ability and skeletal structure. Yeah. So, there isn't that. But what does happen is that we have these sort of unconscious beliefs around this, which do get embedded often. But what happens if you have that kind of thing? It's not that, it's like CEOs have to be, tall. But what happens is you're 6 feet or taller. You walk into the room. Everyone goes, leader.
Yeah. You must have something good to say. Yeah.
Until you open your mouth and start talking. And then everyone goes, no, not leader. Yeah. You're 5'9" or shorter. You walk into the room. Nobody says leader until you prove it. So the basic challenge is that dominant groups are assumed to be competent until they show they're incompetent, and non-dominant groups are assumed to be incompetent until they prove they're competent. Well, I need people analytics to help me run through that.
Yeah. So is that the promise then of using sort of analytics, using a numeric-driven approach, is that let's say, from the recruitment phase and then into, promotion, retention, that we could say we're going to take height out of the picture because we're not going to go with your gut feeling. We're going to go with metrics of how successful you've been.
But it still presupposes that you don't have this belief about that dominant groups are competent until they show they're incompetent. I did work with one corporation, and they had a quartiling system. 1 was top, 4 was bottom.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Dominant groups were assumed, as they looked at the data, dominant groups were assumed to be first or second quartile until they showed they were not.
They start there. They start in that bucket.
And non-dominant groups were assumed to be second or third quartile until they proved they were first. Okay, that was data. So you got the data, now what? Now what do you do with that? Mm-hmm. How do you what are the tools that actually can help people so that they don't have those sort of biased unconscious beliefs? about who people are, because you can have all the intake do all the intake that you want. I think many organizations are doing actually quite a good job of intake, but it's the upgrade that becomes the problem.
And so I think we've touched on a little bit what the promise is of the data, is that the data can tell you things that were invisible to you before, because it was just so natural to promote those dominant groups that probably nobody realized that there was this bias of bucketing them at the top, right? So the data can reveal what's invisible. What resistance have you encountered, Joelle, who you do consulting, and when you bring data like that to a company, is there this sense, and again, going back to that Moneyball scene where they're like, no, I know it, I've been doing this for a long time, and I know a winner when I see it, right? Is there a sense that, there's a reluctance to sometimes trust the data because they say, no, I know what's going on, and it's not that?
There's a reluctance to trust data, but there's a reluctance to even collect the data that's going to give the answer. So we were working with an organization who wanted to hire us to help them increase the diversity at the top of their hiring funnel, right? The reason we don't have Black, Hispanic, and white female engineers is because they're not applying to our jobs, so come help us fix our job descriptions. That was their hypothesis. And we said, before we do that, we would like to look at what's going on in your hiring funnel to understand if the data bears that out, because we don't want to go put a ton of resources to bringing people in who you won't then hire, who you won't then apply fair criteria to. So if we're going to work with you, we need to look at what's going on right now first. And there was a lot of resistance to that. They said, we know what the problem is. We know who we're seeing in our applicant database. We know. Finally, we were able to convince them. And we looked at what was going on in there. And I should say, one of the other things that they wanted to do is they wanted to anonymize resumes. This is a hot topic today. Take names off resumes, and we'll solve all of our hiring problems, and we'll be fair, amazing companies. Great.
That works until you have that you were part of the Asian Pacific Student Association,
or
that somebody else was part of the the polo club versus somebody else had to work the part-time job to
Yes,
pay for school.
really great recent research on socioeconomic status perceived from resumes. That's one of the problems. The other is the resume review stage of the process isn't always where the biggest barriers exist. And so when we took a look at this company's data, we saw that actually people from underrepresented groups were passing their resume screen at the same rate as majority group members. What they weren't passing were technical phone screens and on-site interviews, areas where identity is particularly salient because you're talking to people, you're seeing people. And so their whole hypothesis was, this is at the stage of the funnel that we can't control, or maybe it's when our recruiters are screening resumes really quickly, but we as hiring managers will apply fair standards when we're evaluating people. And we showed them data that said that's not the case, that's not what you're doing right now. And their first response was low N count. We can't possibly make that conclusion. But they were wrong. We could possibly make that conclusion. The N count wasn't too low.
Yeah.
And
that's so interesting because that's the part that's hardest to replace, right? You can replace the resume screen with a machine, right? But you can't replace the sort of on-site interview. And then when you say, what are the objective criteria by which you evaluated this candidate? I know at the company that I used to work for, there was a very subjective criteria. They always said, well, there's also the airport test. Do I want to be stranded at the airport for 4 hours with this person, right?
At companies, that's called culture fit.
Yeah, and it's like, well, okay, now I can't argue with that, because if you're saying, oh yeah, they got all the questions right, but there was the airport test, there's no.
Yeah, so I think my general point was just that there's most resistance to believing the data when it implies that you are doing something wrong. I think people are absolutely willing to believe the data when the story it tells aligns with their beliefs, and people love data in that case. If the results we had to show them were, hey, women just aren't applying to jobs at your company, you're trying.
They would love that.
They just,
it's the pipeline.
Or like, women aren't even getting degrees in this field, so I guess there's nothing you can do. They would love that data. That wasn't the story that it told, and so it was really hard. There was a lot of pushback to the methodology. It took like 6 months before the company was like, maybe we should change our hiring process. And we were like, yeah, you think? So I think people love data when it confirms their existing beliefs. It's kind of classic confirmation bias. But when it doesn't align with their beliefs, they reject the premise.
And so Derek, turning back to sort of the academic side of this, are there any recent innovations that are promising to help at those other stages where you're in the interview, you're in the technical phase of the interview, to help give people some guidance so that they can check their own biases in that process?
There's a lot of literature that looks at the impact of training interventions, that looks at the impact of different social psychological mechanisms for helping us to curb our biases. I think that if I were to just kind of summarize the general trends there, the first thing is we've got to be aware that we can be biased, which is a major hurdle for a lot of folks. Once there's that awareness that we are indeed capable of bias, then it's a matter of understanding where my biases are, and then approaching every potential selection exercise as an opportunity for those biases to showcase themselves. So that awareness gives people at least a fighting chance. And then there are things that you can do from the structural side, from the organizational standpoint, in terms of increasing checks and balances, getting multiple perspectives involved, making sure that that there's not an over-reliance on any one piece of information. So for instance, from Malcolm Gladwell's talk yesterday, it's not necessarily that we include this, but do we overweight it relative to what its contribution is to the ultimate criterion? So I think there are definitely promising avenues that are appearing there, but again, we're never going to generate that panacea where there's that one study or that one program of studies that comes out and says, here we go, this is the solution.
I think, I think in this respect, we maybe are looking at it from the wrong end of the telescope. In the sense that if we say, okay, what we really are looking for is this cognitive diversity, right, which we say that's the end goal of this, that's the Scott Page innovation and creativity stuff, right? But then I think we have to say, okay, how can the people analytics help us with that? And, for example, Catherine Phillips' work at Columbia, where she's found that, homogeneous groups don't come to better solutions, they just think they did. And heterogeneous groups come to better solutions, they just don't think they did.
Yeah, because the process was hard, so you feel good about it at the end.
Exactly, and so what that tells you is you get to Noah's Ark, but then you forget to teach people how to deal with Noah's Ark. And to me, that it's this, what are the dynamics of cognitive diversity that occur? So who gets overheard, who gets underheard, kind of thing. My book is called The Loudest Duck, and there's a reason I call it The Loudest Duck. And the basic notion is that American men, if you will, have been taught the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Speak up and you get what you want. The Japanese have been taught the nail that sticks out gets hit on the head. Don't speak up. Women have been taught if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And the Chinese are taught the loudest duck gets shot. So my point is if you have your, you do have your diversity, all right, and you're in a meeting, and you have a wheel, a duck, a nail, and a nice, and the only person talking is the wheel, And so then the manager, who may be a good manager but a little unconscious, goes, wheel, good ideas. Wheel, good ideas. I have a promotion to give. Oh, I think I'll give it to the wheel. So the nail, duck, nice have been seriously disadvantaged, and the manager hasn't been taught to understand that perhaps they have to invite the wheel, duck, nice to speak, and be what I call be a little bit of a traffic cop. Hold on, wheel, let's hear from duck, kind of thing. But those are the tools, and I think some of the people analytics stuff that's starting to happen now is going to help that.
Yeah. And I think when you listen to people, they would be able to tell you that was their experience. And so I want to pivot a little bit because we have this bias that when we talk about people analytics, our minds go machine learning, big data. That's what people analytics is. But as Maxine pointed out, if the N isn't there, what you need is your spidey sense. You need to listen to people. You need to talk to people, and actually, they know what's happening. They know what's holding them back if you ask them. So I want to give Joelle a chance to speak on this because this is something that her company does, is goes in and and gathers this more qualitative data, and that's still data. So tell us about what's the promise of that, and where have you seen it really open people's eyes when you got those stories from?
It is still data. Thank you for saying that. I think qualitative data is great for a few reasons. One is if there's too small an N count to derive meaningful numbers. The other is it can really bring quantitative data to life. So one thing that we do a lot in our work is we do surveys. We call it these surveys inclusion surveys, and they're looking at constructs that we know are particularly important to experiences of inclusion, things like belonging, belonging uncertainty, fairness, access to resources, voice, are people's feelings and ideas getting heard. So that's data. But then when we do focus groups, when we do interviews, we can actually see what's underlying that. So maybe we find that Latinas in an organization are less likely to say that they feel like their voice is heard. Then we can do focus groups to learn, well, it's all about what's going on in meetings. It's all about the fact that these meetings are optimizing for interrupters, and these women are consistently telling us that they're not as comfortable interrupting. Or maybe we see that across an organization, parents, both men and women, are more likely to say that they don't feel like they belong in that organization. That's interesting. And then when we do focus groups, we learn that, well, this organization's social events are always at night. They're always after 7 p.m., and parents are the people that are least likely to be able to attend those events. So it's giving us often not just the what, but the why. And then we can give those stories back to organizations, and what we're telling them isn't just belonging uncertainty is an issue here. We're telling them, and here's a really concrete thing you can do about it. Start having events that aren't at night. Start having events during the day. Have more structured socializing opportunities. So now we don't just have like a curious problem, we have actually a solution.
Yep. Anything to add to that as far as the qualitative side? Or? I won't put you on the spot. We'll keep going. But
okay, taking that even a step further, because it's exactly correct what Joelle is saying as to who gets included, who gets excluded, not even understanding it. But you know, the point of the matter is that therefore managers need to be held to have a different set of tools around this kind of thing. Although I call it the seed in the soil. You know, the seed is the institution, that is the management, who has to have these awarenesses of the dynamics, and the data helps see that awareness. But the the seed is the individual, you know. So in a diverse workplace, the individual also has to learn to deal with diversity themselves. Right. You know, so they perhaps have to get a little out of their comfort zone.
Let me push you on this a little bit. Yeah. What have you seen, you know, doing the historical analytics that over your career that has worked? So what are some changes that you can point to that just a company did X and I saw this change?
All right, okay, I'll give you an example of that. We know that critical feedback's essential, right? Linda Hill, Harvard Business School. 2 people start at the same place. One gets critical feedback, one gets stretch assignments, and one gets mentoring and sponsoring, the other does not. In 5 years' time, there's a performance difference. Okay, so if we look at critical feedback, we actually know that like is comfortable giving critical feedback to like, but like is very uncomfortable giving critical feedback to not like. Right? And so the not like is likely to get something like, well, you're doing fine, you know, because you're uncomfortable. And if you're giving the feedback, you're worried that if I give this critical feedback to the not like's going to think the only reason I'm getting this critical feedback is that I just don't like not likes. Yeah. And that you're worried that the not like is now going to go run to the legal department. Yeah. So the human nature is curb your feedback. Second element of that is that we also know that in some cultures, it's perfectly acceptable to state your accomplishments, right? I mean, some people state their accomplishment when they sharpen their pencil well. You know, I've got to tell my manager I sharpened my pencil well. Yeah. And some people do huge jobs, and their cultural norm is not to state their accomplishments because they've been taught, be humble, don't brag, whatever. But unless the manager is aware you've got these 2 differentials, then you're going to keep going to the person who sharpens the pencil well. So one tool that I've seen that works very well is what I call, and implement it, is something called 3 up, 3 down every 3 months. What does that mean? Every 3 months, you know, you go to the manager, the individual goes to the manager and says to the manager, these are the 3 things I think I'm doing well. Stating accomplishments. Manager tells them the 3 things they need to work on. Critical feedback. And they do it every 3 months.
And if you just build it in, then you can't run away from it.
You build it into the HR process. We also know that critical feedback past 3 months doesn't change behavior. So this once a year critical feedback stuff doesn't work. Right. So the point is that's a very finite kind of thing to do, which then overcomes these issues around who gets critical feedback and these issues about who's willing to state their accomplishments.
I want to talk a little bit about oh yeah, Derek, please.
Just wanted to jump in really quickly and piggyback on something that Joelle said earlier about the importance of looking at things qualitatively in addition to quantitatively. I think we've long known the value of triangulation when we're studying issues, you know, from a research standpoint. But I think it's also really important to recognize that qualitative data can also tell us where to look from a quantitative standpoint. Right. And I think that oftentimes gets lost in organizations and on scholars in terms of seeing the value of qualitative data. We're now starting to see more of it, from a grounded theory standpoint in, academia. But I think within organizations, it's also a great starting point to help uncover, here's where we should be looking as we start to do, more of our predictive modeling, as we start to, dive deeper into the data to figure out, what's going on. It can give us those starting points.
And I think one thing I would just add to that is, I think building on the point that Maxine made earlier, I also think sometimes you don't need data, and sometimes you don't need maybe qualitative or quantitative data. We just have enough existing academic research, or what we could call in a more fun way a sniff test, to know what the problem is. So we had a company ask us recently. They had this idea. They wanted to change their career website to make it more inclusive. Great. They were like, we want to survey 10,000 people from different backgrounds to see how our website shows up to them, to see if it seems inclusive. We want to undertake a 6-month project to do that. And we were like, okay, we spent 2 minutes looking at their website, and we were like, everyone on your website is white or Asian. Women are featured in images only in administrative roles. You use a ton of fixed mindset language. You use a ton of masculine language. Here are 10 recommendations. Do those things today. You don't need to do a big survey. There's a wealth of academic research on this, and you can just make this change cheaply and quickly. So I love data. I love doing things that are company specific, but I also think sometimes that's just not practical or necessary, and the outcome that it would lead to would be the same at the end of the day.
I want to dive into an audience question, because we got one that I really like, which is that, all of this can apply to sort of the standard channels that we have for bringing people in and screening people, but we also know that referrals are hugely important in how people find their way to organizations, right? And there's economics research on this. There's a paper called Why the Referential Treatment and stuff like that really shows that getting a referral is the #1 thing that you can do to increase your chances of getting hired in an organization. So when things like that, referral to get in and then network to advance is so important, what do you do about that when the referral network and the advancement network is not going to be there for the people who historically have not been in this type of organization?
So I, as a woman, don't like to ever speak twice in a row on a panel, because it might make you think I'm annoying and not like me. But we did some really cool research on this. So one thing we found is that actually just priming people to think about their networks a little bit differently can have a huge impact. So we did a study at Pinterest and we've written about this publicly, so that's why I'm allowed to share their name. And their engineering team, they looked at their referral pool and they were like, wow, this looks exactly like our existing workforce. It's incredibly homogenous. Probably that's because people's networks are incredibly homogenous. What do we do? And we're like, yeah, people's networks are incredibly homogenous, but also, is it possible that when people are thinking of who to refer, they're being impacted by the lens, the pattern of who is here now? Because that's kind of the match that we're trying to make in our heads. So we were like, what if we just primed people to think differently? So we had a senior leader in engineering send an email to the engineering team and say, our referral network is super homogenous. Over the next 6 weeks, spend time thinking about your own network and thinking about who might add diversity to this team and refer them. And over that 6-week period, we saw a 30% increase in the number of women referred and a 5,500% increase in the number of Black and Hispanic engineers referred. So just by asking people to think about their networks differently, we saw a huge impact. And the one thing on the internal side we did recently, asked a C-suite team to spend a month recording the amount of time they spent in informal conversations with people on their teams. Informal hallway chats, lunches, coffee chats, and they were all shocked by the homogeneity of the people that they were having these little informal chats with and what that added up to. So what they could do is then just schedule more one-on-one meetings with the folks that they weren't running into in the hallway.
So we're basically out of time, so I'm going to move on because I want to just end on a note about organizational culture, because we are almost all sort of approaching this from the HR side, where we're saying, hey, diversity is really important. And there are some times when that comes head to head with somebody who says, yeah, but you're asking me to change how we do things, and I need to do things like this in order to close the deal, in order to get the money, in order to do whatever, right? And what do you say when, and the example that I give for this is that there was a study that came out that showed that if women visited computer science labs that were decorated in Star Wars posters and traditionally sort of male nerd decor, they were much less likely to choose computer science as a major, right? And so I ask people to say, what are the Star Wars posters in your organization that are things you don't need the Star Wars poster to do your job? You might think you do, and it's always been there, but how do we identify those things? So when the HR side needs to say to the organizational side, we need to do things differently, how do you do that? I'm gonna let somebody over here.
Well, I think data obviously is important. I was worked with one organization that was a research-based organization, and they couldn't figure out kind of why the men seemed to be doing better than the women. So what they ended up doing was looking at the assignments of the research. Well, it turned out that the men were getting the big cap, large manufacturing companies to research. The women were getting the small to medium mid cap, and the healthcare and the very stereotypical, oh, a women would understand healthcare, things like that. And so once they had the data, the managers had no idea that they were doing this assignment in this way. Once they had the data, they could at least say, okay, well, is there a systemic way that we can actually think about assignments to level that playing field? So, I think data are useful with this kind of thing, but then of course you have to do something about it.
Derek and Joelle, any other closing thoughts?
I spend a lot of time talking with folks in organizations about making sure that they question history all the time.
Yeah.
A lot of things within organizations we do just on the basis of precedent. And anytime that comes up when I'm in conversations or when I'm consulting with an organization and they say, this is the way that we've always done things, I make a point of saying, okay, well, I'm going to need you to explain to me why.
Yeah.
And eventually they stop saying that because they become very uncomfortable trying to defend why they've always done it that way.
Because it just is because they've always done it that way. That's the why. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I will let us move on to our next session, but thanks so much for the panelists.